Story 1. The First Encounter. The clock on the dashboard ticked past midnight, casting a greenish glow over the face of Charlie Davies, a veteran mortuary transport driver. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as his van rolled along the quiet, empty streets, the tires humming on the asphalt. Nights were Charlie's favorite time to work. The stillness offered a rare tranquility, a break from the chaos of the living world. He'd been on this job for nearly 20 years, transporting the deceased from hospitals, homes, and accident sites, to morgues, funeral homes, and anywhere else they needed to be. He'd long since grown accustomed to the stillness of his passengers, finding a kind of respect in their silence. Tonight was no different. Or at least, it shouldn't have been. The call had come just after 11 p.m., a body to be picked up from a small hospice on the outskirts of town. Standard protocol. He'd arrived, signed the necessary paperwork, and carefully loaded the body, an elderly man, recently passed after a long illness, into the back of the van. The nurses had mentioned something about the man being quiet and kind, someone who would be missed by the staff. Charlie offered a respectful nod, a silent farewell, and climbed back into the driver's seat. Just another night. The roads grew darker as he left the city limits behind, the glow of streetlights giving way to stretches of quiet countryside. His headlights cut through the dark, illuminating only the endless blackness ahead. He leaned back, settling into the familiar, meditative rhythm of the drive. But about 20 minutes in, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a faint thump from the back of the van. Charlie glanced at the rearview mirror instinctively, though he saw nothing unusual. Probably a pothole. He adjusted his hands on the wheel and refocused on the road. Then it came again, a dull thud, followed by what sounded like a faint rustling, as though something or someone was moving. Charlie frowned, glancing at the rearview mirror again. Maybe a strap had come loose? It wasn't unheard of, though he prided himself on making sure everything was secure. Deciding it was better to check than to ignore it, he pulled over to the side of the road, his headlights illuminating an empty field stretching out under the night sky. He climbed out and opened the back doors, half expecting to find the gurney unsteady or perhaps something that had rolled loose. But everything was exactly as he'd left it. The old man lay covered, his face concealed by the white sheet, the straps fastened securely across his chest and legs. Satisfied, Charlie closed the doors and returned to the driver's seat. He chalked it up to fatigue. Working nights could mess with a person's head, even one as experienced as himself. But no sooner had he pulled back onto the road than he heard it again, the sound of movement, the muffled creak of the gurney shifting ever so slightly. Charlie's stomach clenched. He glanced in the mirror, eyes narrowing at the vague, sheet-covered form lying in the back. It was impossible for the body to move, he knew that. Maybe the road was just uneven. But the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. A few more miles passed in eerie silence. Then, just as he began to relax, a soft whisper drifted from the back seat, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Charlie." He froze, his knuckles going white on the wheel. The voice was faint, but unmistakable, and it sent a chill racing down his spine. No one knew his name on this route, not the staff, not the patient, no one. And yet, there it was, spoken so clearly it might have come from a living passenger right behind him. He didn't dare look in the mirror. Instead, he forced himself to keep his eyes on the road, his mind racing. Maybe he'd imagined it, he told himself. A trick of the wind or the van's mechanics. Then he heard it again, louder this time. "Charlie." The voice was weak, barely more than a breath, but it filled the cramped space of the van. He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to pull over again, to throw open the back doors and confront whatever lay behind him. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he gripped the wheel tighter, his heart hammering in his chest as he pressed his foot down on the gas, desperate to reach his destination. The whisper came again, closer, as if the voice was right beside him. "Charlie, please." He couldn't take it anymore. Heart pounding, he pulled over onto the side of the road once again, the van coming to a screeching halt. For a long moment, he sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the empty stretch of highway in front of him. Then, slowly, he turned around. The back of the van was dimly lit by the faint glow of the overhead light. The gurney lay as he'd left it, the body still covered by the white sheet. He exhaled, relief washing over him. Maybe he was just hearing things. But as he moved to turn back around, he saw it, the faintest movement beneath the sheet, as though something were shifting ever so slightly. He blinked, barely daring to breathe, his eyes locked on the form. Then, in one sudden, horrific motion, the sheet slipped, revealing the old man's face. His eyes were closed, but his mouth was moving, forming silent words. Charlie stared, unable to tear his gaze away, as the man's lips moved in a silent plea, mouthing the words over and over. "Help me! Help me!" A cold, numbing dread settled over him, rooting him to the spot. He knew the man was dead. He'd checked the paperwork, seen the nurse's somber expressions. There was no way this could be real. And yet, there he was, lying on the gurney, whispering to him with pale, unmoving lips. Charlie felt a sharp, instinctual urge to run, to abandon the van and flee into the night. But something held him there, a morbid curiosity or perhaps a sense of duty that kept him rooted to the spot. Who are you?" he whispered, barely able to get the words out. The man's eyes flickered open. They were clouded, the milky haze of death over them, yet somehow they focused on him, piercing and unblinking. "Please, don't leave me here," the voice murmured, weak and desperate, filling the van with an unnatural chill. Charlie's mind reeled, grappling with the impossibility of what he was seeing. You're dead," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The man's lips moved again, forming a sad, twisted smile. "Not yet, not all the way." Charlie's blood ran cold. He didn't understand, couldn't understand, but he knew he needed to get away, to leave this impossible scene behind. He reached for the door handle, fumbling in his panic, but before he could pull it open, the man spoke again, his voice stronger this time. "Don't you know? Some of us, we linger. We're not all lucky enough to go peacefully." The voice was filled with a quiet despair, a resignation that chilled Charlie to the bone. He swallowed, his hand still hovering over the door handle. What do you want from me?" The old man's eyes bored into him, filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across lifetimes. "I just want to rest, Charlie. I just want to rest." Charlie's throat tightened, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He knew, deep down, that there was nothing he could do, that this was beyond his understanding. But as he looked into those sorrowful, pleading eyes, he felt a strange compulsion, a need to help, even if he didn't fully understand how. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. I'll get you there. I'll get you where you need to go." The man's face softened, the tension in his expression easing ever so slightly. He closed his eyes, the movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring the promise. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. Charlie sat there for a long moment, the weight of the encounter settling over him. Then, slowly, he turned back around, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. He drove the rest of the way in silence, the van filled with a heavy, oppressive stillness. When he finally arrived at the morgue, he pulled the van to a stop and climbed out, his hands numb as he opened the back doors. The old man lay there, motionless, his face peaceful beneath the white sheet. Charlie stared at him for a moment, half expecting him to stir again, to whisper one final plea. But he remained still, as though he had finally found the rest he'd been searching for. With a trembling hand, Charlie reached out, gently pulling the sheet back over the man's face. He stood there in the silence, his heart heavy, before finally closing the doors. As he walked back to the driver's seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that he had witnessed something beyond his understanding. And as he climbed back into the van and started the engine, he knew that this drive, this silent journey with the dead, would haunt him for the rest of his life. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. Story 2. The Shadow in the Mirror. The hospital parking lot was silent, cloaked in shadows under the dim glow of a single streetlight. Charlie Davies leaned back in the driver's seat of his van, waiting for the call that would tell him it was time to pick up another body. Tonight was one of those nights that felt colder than usual, the chill seeping in through the van's windows and settling into his bones. He rubbed his hands together, glancing around the empty lot, letting out a slow breath. It was just past 3 in the morning, and fatigue had started to creep into his mind, weighing down his eyelids. He reached for his thermos and took a long sip of coffee, hoping the bitter heat would shake off some of the sleepiness. Just another quiet night. Just him and the empty van, waiting. But as he lowered his thermos and caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror, something odd caught his attention. He squinted, leaning in, staring at the shadowy figure he saw in the mirror. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, a smear on the glass, or maybe the silhouette of a distant tree casting its shadow. But as he looked closer, a chill ran through him. The figure was vaguely human, its shape barely discernible against the darkened interior of the van. It was sitting in the back seat, head tilted to the side in a posture that suggested it was watching him intently. The face was hazy, almost undefined, but he could make out 2 hollow spots where the eyes should have been, empty sockets staring into him. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. He turned around quickly, expecting to find someone, or something, sitting in the back seat. But it was empty, just as he'd left it. He blinked, shaking his head as he turned back around, half laughing at himself for jumping at shadows. "Get a grip, Charlie," he muttered. "You're just tired." "It's nothing." But when he glanced in the mirror again, the figure was still there, closer this time, as if it had moved forward by several inches. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into him, expression unreadable but undeniably present. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He could feel his pulse quickening, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to look away, but the figure's empty stare held him in place, drawing him in with a silent, chilling demand. He tried to shake the feeling off, telling himself it was just his imagination, a remnant of fatigue playing tricks on him. But his mind couldn't shake the memory of the voice he'd heard last week, the whispering plea of the old man who had spoken to him from the back of this very van. As he stared, the figure seemed to move again, its shape shifting closer still. It was no longer seated. Now, it appeared to be crouching, leaning forward with long, thin fingers that stretched out toward the driver's seat. The hollowness of its eyes was sharper now, 2 black voids that seemed to reach out, pulling him into their endless darkness. Charlie forced himself to look away, his chest heaving as he sucked in a deep breath. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, to convince himself that this was all in his head. Maybe he'd just been pushing himself too hard. Nights on end in a job like his could make a person see things. But as much as he tried to ignore it, he felt an overwhelming sense that he was no longer alone. The air inside the van grew heavy, suffocating, filled with a coldness that seemed to seep into his skin. Slowly, hesitantly, he glanced at the rearview mirror again. The figure was now only inches away, its face, or what could be called a face, close enough that he could make out faint details. A pale, translucent skin stretched tight over bone, hollow eyes staring at him from an expressionless mask. Its mouth was a thin, dark line, closed, yet somehow speaking 1,000 silent words that filled him with dread. "Who, what do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. In response, the figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement, as if trying to understand him. Its empty gaze held a depth of sorrow and malice, an ancient suffering that seemed to seep into the air, filling the space between them. Charlie felt a shiver crawl down his spine, his stomach knotting with a deep, primal fear. He looked away again, his hand reaching for the door handle, thinking he could throw open the door and escape into the parking lot. But something held him back, a strange, binding force that kept him locked in place, forcing him to face the silent horror in the mirror. When he dared to look back, the figure's face was close enough to touch, its hollow eyes now level with his own. He felt trapped, ensnared by the darkness in its gaze, a blackness that seemed to stretch on forever, as if it held the memories of countless souls lost to the void. Then, Slowly, the figure raised one of its skeletal hands, pressing its palm against the glass on the other side of the mirror. The fingers were long and thin, almost insect-like, their touch leaving dark smudges on the surface. Charlie's breath hitched as he watched, his own hand reaching up in a trembling reflex to touch the glass on his side. For a moment, his fingers hovered over the mirror, inches away from the figure's ghostly hand. He could feel a faint, icy energy radiating from the glass, a coldness that bit into his skin. And then, without warning, the figure's mouth parted, revealing a dark, hollow abyss where its voice emerged, a voice that seemed to resonate not in his ears, but deep within his mind. "Charlie," it whispered, dragging his name out in a slow, mournful tone. The sound was layered, as though 1,000 voices were speaking in unison, each one filled with a bone-chilling sadness. "Why did you leave me?" Charlie's eyes widened, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't understand. He hadn't left anyone, at least, not that he could remember. But the figure's accusation cut into him, filling him with a sense of guilt he couldn't explain. I don't know you," he managed to stammer, his voice trembling. The figure's head tilted further, an unnatural movement that sent a shiver through him. Its empty eyes held him captive, filled with a darkness that seemed to reach into his very soul. "Yes, you do," it replied, its voice barely a whisper, echoing through his mind like a long-forgotten memory. Suddenly, images flashed through his mind, images he couldn't place, yet felt all too familiar. A woman's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide with terror. A hand, reaching out from the darkness, grasping for help. And then, the unmistakable shape of a body bag, zipped shut, sealing away the memory forever. Charlie shook his head, trying to dispel the images, but they clung to him, a persistent, suffocating reminder of something he tried to forget. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't remember." The figure's mouth twisted into a grim smile, a cold, humorless expression that held no warmth, no forgiveness. "You left us," it said, the words laced with a bitterness that cut into him like a knife. "And now, we're coming back." Charlie's blood ran cold. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, the ghosts of those he'd transported, the souls he'd laid to rest. He had always believed he was just doing a job, helping people find peace. But now, as he stared into the hollow eyes of the figure, he realized that some of them hadn't found peace at all. Some of them had been left behind, forgotten in the darkness. And now, they wanted him to remember. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from the mirror, its hollow eyes piercing into him. "We're always here, Charlie," it whispered. "Waiting. Watching." He felt a scream rise in his throat, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, trapped in the van with this ghostly figure, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a shroud. Then, in one final, desperate move, he forced his hand down on the door handle and threw it open, stumbling out into the parking lot. The cold night air hit him like a slap, breaking the spell. He staggered backward, gasping for breath, his heart pounding as he looked back at the van. The interior was dark and empty. The mirror reflected only his own terrified face, eyes wide and haunted. For a long time, he stood there, breathing heavily, the silence of the parking lot pressing in on him. He half expected the figure to appear again, to crawl out of the shadows and drag him back into its darkness. But nothing happened. The van remained silent, its windows reflecting the empty night. Slowly, he climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, to banish the memory of those hollow eyes, that chilling voice. But as he drove away from the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone, that the shadows would always be waiting for him, lurking just beyond the edge of the mirror. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear the faint echo of that voice, whispering his name in the darkness. Story 3. The Late-Night Detour. It was supposed to be a routine drive back to the morgue, the kind Charlie Davies had done hundreds, if not thousands, of times before. His last pickup was a middle-aged woman, a Jane Doe from a quiet suburban hospital on the outskirts of town. Her death had been sudden, unexpected, and without family to claim her, she'd ended up as just another name on his transport log. The road was clear, the night unusually still as he settled into his familiar route back, his GPS tracking the quiet path of empty highways and side streets that he knew so well. But just as he crossed into the outer limits of the forest that lined the route, his GPS flickered. The small screen went black for a second, and then a new route appeared, instructing him to take a sharp right. Frowning, he glanced at the screen. He didn't remember seeing this road before, and he'd been through these back roads plenty of times. Great, he muttered to himself, wondering if it was another glitch. But as he glanced up, the headlights illuminated a road marker, one pointing down the narrow, forested lane that the GPS insisted was the fastest route. With a sigh, he turned, the van crunching over gravel as he started down the unfamiliar road. The forest closed in on either side, thick, towering trees casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. He'd never seen this part of the forest before, and the uneasy silence made his skin prickle. The further he drove, the thicker the fog grew, winding around the van like grasping fingers. After a few minutes, the road felt like it was tightening, the trees leaning in like they were watching him. The thick fog swallowed up the headlights, creating a hazy tunnel through which he could barely see. Then, just on the roadside, he saw her. Charlie blinked, unsure if he was really seeing what he thought he saw. It was a woman standing alone, her head tilted at an odd angle, her face pale and hollow-eyed, illuminated briefly by his headlights before disappearing back into the fog. He felt his chest tighten, an eerie chill snaking down his spine. She looked familiar. No, he thought, pressing his foot harder on the gas, keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead. It's just the fog playing tricks. It couldn't have been her, but as soon as he thought it, the memory of her face rose in his mind. She was one of his pickups, a young woman who'd passed in a car accident, her lifeless form once laid in the back of his van. He could remember her face vividly, the sight of her glassy eyes staring into nothingness. Yet now, she was standing on the side of the road, staring directly at him. He forced himself to keep his eyes ahead, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But no sooner had he shaken off her image than he saw another figure up ahead. This one was older, an elderly man with deep wrinkles and empty eyes. He stood motionless, watching the van as it passed, his gaze hollow and accusatory. Charlie's stomach turned as he recognized him too, another face from his past, someone he transported months ago. The forest seemed to close in further, the fog growing thicker, suffocating. Charlie's heart hammered as he tried to focus on the road, but the faces kept appearing, each one a haunting reminder of the bodies he transported, the lives that had ended before finding their final resting place. As he passed each figure, their eyes never wavered from him, following the van with an intense, almost desperate gaze. Charlie clenched his jaw, telling himself it was just fatigue, the dark playing tricks on his mind. He'd worked too many late nights, that had to be it. The radio crackled to life suddenly, jolting him from his thoughts. Static filled the van, the sound harsh against the silent night. He glanced at it, hoping it was just a malfunction. But through the static, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Charlie. It was a whisper, faint and crackling, but unmistakable. His name, spoken in a voice he knew, a voice that had once belonged to one of his pickups. His hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to ignore it, pressing down harder on the gas. But the whisper came again, louder this time. Why, did you leave me? Charlie's chest tightened as a chorus of voices joined the first, each one layered over the static, weaving together in an eerie, accusatory chant. Charlie. Why did you leave us? Charlie, don't leave. He swallowed, his throat dry as he glanced in the rearview mirror. There, behind him in the van, he saw the faintest outline of shapes, a row of figures, each one sitting silently, staring at him with those same hollow, accusing eyes. His mind screamed for him to stop, to pull over and escape into the forest, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The figures were there, right behind him, filling the van with their silent, dreadful presence. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Leave me alone." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the van with a cacophony of cries and whispers, each one pleading, accusing, demanding answers. Their voices overlapped, merging into one horrific, unrelenting question that echoed in his mind. "Why did you leave us, Charlie? Why didn't you stay?" He forced himself to keep driving, his vision blurring as his mind raced, searching for some way out of this nightmare. But the road stretched on endlessly, the fog thickening until he could barely see a few feet in front of him. As he drove, the figures on the roadside grew more distinct, their faces clearer, each one a ghostly reminder of the bodies he'd transported, the lives he'd ferried into the unknown. And each one stared at him, their eyes hollow, filled with an indescribable sorrow. He thought he recognized some of them, faces he tried to forget, faces that had haunted him in quiet moments, faces that now seemed to have come back to claim him. The radio crackled again, a new voice cutting through the static. This one was softer, a child's voice, filled with an innocence that made his heart clench. "Why did you leave me, Charlie?" He felt a tear slip down his cheek as he recognized the voice. It was the voice of a young girl, one he'd transported years ago after a tragic accident. He remembered her face, her lifeless body, and the way he'd driven her to the morgue in silence, telling himself she was at peace. But now, as her voice echoed through the van, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, a guilt he couldn't explain or escape. The figures were closer now, crowding around the van, their faces pressing against the windows, their empty eyes staring in at him. He could feel their cold presence, the chill of the fog seeping into the van as they whispered his name, over and over. "Charlie, come with us. Charlie, don't leave." He couldn't take it anymore. In a fit of desperation, he slammed on the brakes, the van skidding to a halt in the middle of the deserted road. He sat there, breathing heavily, his hands trembling on the wheel as he looked around. The figures were gone. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the empty, silent road stretching out before him. But the weight of their presence lingered, the echo of their voices still ringing in his ears. Slowly, he turned off the van, sitting in the silence, trying to calm his racing heart. He closed his eyes, taking deep, steady breaths, telling himself it was over, that he was alone. But as he opened his eyes and looked in the rearview mirror, he saw them, sitting silently in the back of the van, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes fixed on him with a haunting intensity. "Charlie," they whispered, their voices soft, filled with a sorrow that cut into him like a knife. "Don't leave us." He felt a tear slip down his cheek as he realized he couldn't escape them. They were with him, a part of him, the weight of his past that he could never outrun. With a heavy heart, he turned the key, starting the engine and setting off down the road once more. The fog seemed to clear as he drove, the figures fading into the shadows, but their presence lingered, their voices echoing in his mind. And as he drove on through the quiet, empty night, he knew he would never truly be alone again. Story 4. The Passenger. Charlie Davies wasn't new to eerie encounters in his line of work, but this night was shaping up to be one he wouldn't forget. The rain had been relentless all evening, pouring down in thick sheets that hammered against the windshield and turned the city streets into rivers. Thunder rumbled overhead as he sat in his van, checking his watch and silently hoping the night would end without any more calls. But, of course, the phone rang. It was the dispatcher with an emergency pickup. An accident on the far side of town, out by the waterfront. There was only one fatality, a man in his late 20s. Charlie didn't recognize the name, but that was typical. Most of the deceased were strangers, people who would enter his life briefly before he transported them to their final stop. He sighed, pulled on his jacket, and prepared himself for the long drive through the storm. As he drove through the sheets of rain, the storm seemed to get worse, lashing against the windows with fierce winds that rocked the van. He kept his eyes on the road, squinting through the downpour, hoping he wouldn't miss his turn in the poor visibility. Finally, he arrived at the accident scene. Emergency lights flashed through the rain, casting eerie shadows that flickered over the wrecked car. He parked a little way off, stepping out into the rain as he grabbed his gear, bracing himself for the work that lay ahead. After speaking briefly with a paramedic, Charlie learned that the man had died on impact. The body was already wrapped up, covered, and ready for transport. The sight was routine by now, but something about the air felt strange. The paramedics were quick to leave, flashing him weary nods as they packed up and drove off, leaving Charlie alone with the rain and the ominous silence that filled the scene. He loaded the body into the back of the van, the steady rhythm of the rain an unwelcome soundtrack to the task. As he closed the back doors and turned to head to the driver's seat, he paused, feeling a strange sense of unease prickle over his skin. When he opened the driver's side door and climbed into the seat, the van suddenly felt colder, the air thick with a chill that seeped into his bones. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease, and turned on the heat. His fingers were slick and chilled from the rain, and he fumbled slightly as he put the key in the ignition. The van roared to life, and he flipped the windshield wipers on, ready to head back to the morgue. Then, as he glanced to his right, he felt his heart stop. There was someone sitting in the passenger seat. Charlie's breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively leaned back, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the figure. The dim light from the dashboard cast a faint glow over them, illuminating just enough to make out their face. It was a man, young, with short, dark hair and a sharp jawline. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. His clothes were soaked, as though he'd just stepped out of the rain, and his skin was a ghastly shade of pale. Charlie recognized the face immediately. It was the man he'd just loaded into the back of the van. He swallowed, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. This had to be a trick, his mind playing games with him in the dark. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the body in the back lying right where he'd left it. But when he looked back, the only thing reflected in the rearview mirror was the empty back of the van. Charlie's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just the storm and exhaustion getting to him. But the figure beside him made no sound, no movement. It just sat there, its head turned slightly toward him, watching him in silence. "Just a long night," he whispered to himself, forcing his eyes back to the road. "That's all this is." But as he drove, he couldn't shake the presence beside him. He glanced at the figure again, hoping it would vanish, that it was only a hallucination fading away. But the man remained there, as solid as ever, his unblinking gaze fixed ahead, his face expressionless. Charlie felt a chill creep up his spine. The storm outside had grown even more intense, and the van rocked as the wind howled around them. Each crack of thunder seemed to reverberate through his chest, echoing the rapid beat of his heart. Who are you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. But in the heavy silence, the figure slowly turned its head to face him. Charlie froze, his grip tightening on the wheel, as he met the man's gaze. His eyes were dark, empty, yet somehow filled with an unfathomable sorrow. The man's mouth opened, his voice barely a whisper, barely a breath. "Why did you leave me?" Charlie's chest tightened, a feeling of guilt and dread washing over him. I didn't leave you. I just..." The man's gaze held him captive, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Alone, in the rain," the man whispered. "You left me alone." Charlie shook his head, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. "No, I was just doing my job. I didn't mean to." The figure's expression didn't change, but his gaze seemed to pierce through Charlie, filled with a silent accusation that made his stomach churn. Charlie's mind raced as he tried to understand, to explain away the presence beside him. He'd done his job, the same way he'd done it 1,000 times before. He'd collected the body, taken it to the morgue. He hadn't abandoned anyone, hadn't left anyone behind. Yet, the man's gaze never wavered, his hollow eyes reflecting a pain and sorrow that made Charlie's heart ache. He pressed his foot harder on the gas, speeding through the winding roads, desperate to reach the morgue, to put an end to whatever nightmare he'd stumbled into. The figure remained silent beside him, his presence a heavy weight that filled the van, making it hard to breathe. the morgue finally came into view, its dark shape looming through the rain. Charlie pulled into the lot, his hands shaking as he parked and shut off the engine. The silence in the van was deafening, the only sound the steady beat of rain against the roof. Slowly, he turned to face the figure in the passenger seat, half expecting him to still be there, watching him with those sorrowful, accusing eyes. But the seat was empty. He let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him as he realized the man was gone. He hadn't noticed him leave, hadn't seen him open the door or vanish into the night. But somehow, he was gone, leaving only an empty seat and the faint, lingering chill of his presence. Charlie sat there for a moment, staring at the empty seat, his heart still racing. He wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, a trick of his tired mind. But as he reached for the door handle, his eyes fell on the seat, and he froze. There, on the passenger seat, was a single, wet handprint, the outline of a hand pressed into the fabric, as if the man had been sitting there just moments before. Charlie's hands shook as he touched the handprint, feeling the dampness that still lingered on the seat. His mind raced, memories of the man's face, his hollow eyes, his sorrowful voice echoing in his mind. With a deep breath, he climbed out of the van, his legs feeling weak as he made his way to the back to unload the body. He opened the back doors, half expecting the man to be gone, his body vanished into the night. But there he was, lying motionless, wrapped and still, just as Charlie had left him. He hesitated, staring at the lifeless form, the familiar face hidden beneath the cloth. He could almost hear the man's voice, whispering in his mind, the same question that had haunted him on the drive here. "Why did you leave me?" Charlie closed his eyes, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He knew he'd done his job, followed every protocol, every rule. But somehow, he felt as though he'd failed, as though he'd left something behind, something he couldn't explain or understand. He took a deep, shaky breath, pulling the body out of the van and into the morgue, the weight of his burden heavier than ever. And as he walked through the silent halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the man's sorrowful eyes were watching him still, lingering in the shadows. Charlie's nights would never be the same. Because now, he knew that some passengers left more than a body behind. Some left a piece of themselves, a piece that haunted the dark, silent spaces between life and death. Story 5. The Lockdown. Charlie Davies was no stranger to late nights and strange encounters. The dead had become his silent companions, and his van, a lifeless confessional booth where secrets lingered unspoken. But this night, a cold, damp Friday evening, would test him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had just loaded a body into the back, a routine pickup of an elderly woman from a nearby care home, and was set to return to the morgue as a chill mist settled over the city. The streets were nearly deserted as he drove, only the occasional streetlight flickering through the dense fog that clung to the road. The visibility was poor, but Charlie had driven this route 1,000 times, and he knew every curve and bump. He turned up the heater, trying to shake the uncomfortable dampness that had seeped into his clothes. Then, as he drove through an intersection, he felt his van shudder and slow. He frowned, pressing his foot down on the accelerator, but the engine stuttered, the vehicle seeming to resist. As the van coasted to a reluctant halt on a narrow, empty street, he felt a wave of irritation. It was the last thing he needed tonight, a mechanical issue in the middle of nowhere, with fog thickening around him. Charlie muttered to himself and reached for the ignition, ready to try restarting the engine, but as his hand touched the key, the doors around him suddenly clicked. Every lock slid into place, trapping him inside. He froze, confusion flickering across his face. What the? He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pressed the unlock button, but nothing happened. The locks remained stubbornly in place, sealing him inside. With a sinking feeling, he realized he was stuck. He grabbed his phone, intending to call for help, but as he unlocked the screen, the battery icon blinked and the screen went dark. Seriously, he whispered, a sense of unease creeping over him. He'd charged his phone before he'd left, but it was dead now, with no explanation. He stared at the blank screen, a knot forming in his stomach. The van was silent, the only sound the steady beat of his heart pounding in his ears. The fog outside thickened, swirling against the windows until they fogged over, blurring his view of the street. It was as if the van had been swallowed by a cloud, isolated from the rest of the world. Then, from the back of the van, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely more than a breath. "Charlie." He stiffened, his blood running cold. He hadn't imagined it. He was sure he'd heard his name. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the back of the van, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The body lay in its usual place, wrapped and still. He turned back to the front, gripping the wheel as he tried to calm his racing heart. "Just tired. I'm hearing things, that's all." But as he stared at the fogged-up windows, shadows began to take shape. Dark, indistinct forms that seemed to shift and move just outside the van. They were tall, thin figures, their shapes barely discernible through the fogged glass, like silhouettes pressing against the windows, leaning in as if they were trying to peer inside. He felt his chest tighten, his pulse quickening as he watched the shadows shift and flicker, each one a silent observer, circling the van like a pack of predators. He could see faint outlines of faces, hollow and expressionless, their eyes dark and unblinking. Then the whispers began again, faint but growing louder, echoing from every corner of the van. They were voices he couldn't quite understand, murmurs that overlapped and tangled together, filling the air with an eerie hum. He strained to make out the words, but they eluded him, slipping away like the last fragments of a forgotten dream. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The whispers faded for a moment, and then, from the back, he heard a single, clear voice. "Why did you leave us, Charlie?" His breath caught in his throat, and he turned, staring at the body in the back. The voice was different this time, distinct, a woman's voice, soft and familiar, like someone speaking to him from a memory long buried. He felt his hands tremble as he faced forward again, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to him like the fog outside. But as he looked at the dashboard, he noticed something chilling. The fog inside the van was thickening now, creeping up the glass, blotting out the streetlights entirely. He could barely see beyond the windshield, but he didn't need to. The shadows had started to move. They pressed closer to the windows, their dark forms shifting and growing, filling the fogged glass until he felt as though he were surrounded. Then, without warning, a handprint appeared on the passenger side window, faint and ghostly, the impression of long, thin fingers pressed into the glass. He stared, frozen, as another handprint appeared beside it, and then another, until the windows were covered in handprints, each one pressing against the glass as if trying to force their way inside. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices filling the van with their haunting murmurs. "Charlie. Why did you leave us?" "We're waiting, Charlie." His heart raced, panic clawing at his chest as he tried to unlock the doors, but they wouldn't budge. He slammed his fists against the glass, hoping to break it, to escape, but the windows held firm, trapping him inside. The whispers turned to laughter then, a low, chilling sound that echoed in the confined space, each laugh tinged with a mocking tone that sent a shiver down his spine. Desperate, he looked into the rearview mirror, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, sitting in the back seat, was the woman he'd picked up, the elderly woman from the care home. But she was no longer lying down, no longer still and silent. She was sitting upright, her face pale and her eyes wide, staring at him with a cold, lifeless gaze. Her mouth opened, her lips forming a silent word. "Stay." He let out a strangled cry, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine again. The key turned, and for a moment, he thought he'd hear the familiar roar of the engine. But instead, the van stayed silent, the dashboard lights flickering erratically before dying completely. The van was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fog outside, casting eerie shadows over the interior. He looked around, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as the laughter and whispers grew louder, filling every inch of the confined space. And then, from outside the van, he saw them, figures moving in the fog, their hollow faces peering in through the windows. They pressed against the glass, their eyes empty and accusing, their mouths moving silently as they mouthed his name. "Charlie." Don't leave us." He could feel the weight of their gazes, the suffocating sense of dread pressing down on him, filling the van until he could barely breathe. He closed his eyes, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and he whispered to himself, desperate for an escape. "Please, just let me go." The whispers paused, the silence settling over him like a heavy shroud. He opened his eyes, glancing around, hoping the figures were gone, that he'd imagined it all. But as he looked at the dashboard, he noticed something new, a message scrawled in the fog on the windshield, written in a shaky, uneven script. "Stay with us." He let out a choked gasp, his heart racing as he stared at the words. He could feel their presence, the weight of the unseen figures pressing in on him, filling the van with their silent, accusing gaze. In a final act of desperation, he grabbed his phone, hoping against hope that it would turn on, that he could call for help. But the screen remained dark, lifeless. Then, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He froze, his body rigid with fear as he felt the icy fingers press into his shoulder, holding him in place. He didn't dare turn, didn't dare face whatever was behind him. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle, as though they were coaxing him, inviting him to stay. "Stay with us, Charlie." He closed his eyes, his breath shaky as he tried to block out the voices, to push away the cold, creeping dread that filled him. But the hand on his shoulder tightened, and he felt himself pulled back, drawn into the shadows that filled the van. And as the whispers grew louder, filling the air with their haunting, sorrowful song, he felt himself slipping, sinking into the darkness, his final thoughts fading into the endless void of the fog outside. When the van was finally found, parked on a quiet, mist-shrouded street, the windows were still fogged, the doors locked, and inside, the faint outlines of handprints covered every window. But Charlie Davies was nowhere to be found.
If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.